Everybody hear me okay? Oh, all right. All right, so the last time I gave the class, we talked about Abraham, and we went through chapter 15. So what I'm going to start with today is start with chapter 16. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the first part of Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 3, and then I'll summarize the rest of the chapter. So one of the things I want to keep in mind, for you to keep in mind is I take a lot of notes, and so one of the things sometimes I have is problem saying the things that I'm thinking about as I'm reading and doing research. So I've written a lot of those things down. My wife has suffered through this with me a couple of times this week because I've gone over some thoughts with her, and especially when it comes to Lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Lot. And again, these are some of the things that I will talk about and express our thoughts based on the things that I've read. And so we'll just go ahead and start from there. So I'm going to read from Genesis. I'm going to begin with Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarah said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarah. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So again, I promise if I keep saying Abraham or Sarah, it's actually Sarai and Abram at this point in time. So just like we said in the first three verses, 10 years earlier, Abram had believed in God for his son. Sarah at this point in time is now 75 years old. And apparently, as we see, based on the first three verses of chapter 16, she's exhausted her faith. And now Abram also is weakened too. And so with 15 more years to wait for the promise based on the covenant that we talked about in the previous chapters before, she devises her own scheme, which the New Testament identifies in Galatians chapter 4, verses 23, that's according to the flesh. All right, so in thought, precious as the promise of God to Abram had been, it still left one point at this time undetermined: who would be the mother of the promised seed. So instead of waiting for the direction of God in this respect, Sarah seems to obviously have been impatient, and she anticipated the Lord at this point in time. And as we always do when we subvert the promise of God, they took things into their own hands in a manner contrary to God's promise or God's plan at that point in time. And so this will lead to her sorrow and disappointment. And so in their house, this causes conflict and problems. But again, 10 years had passed since Abram had entered Canaan at this point in time. And when Sarah, obviously feeling that the idea of giving birth to the heir, the promise was a hopeless thing. So what she did was basically she followed the common custom at that point in time, where you would give your servant to your husband, and that offspring from that union would be considered the heir. So the consequences of her imprudence caused a lack of peace in her home, which also brought strong criticism, and eventually Hagar decides to leave. And so what else might have followed this difficult time for it's actually difficult to tell what would have happened if the Lord hadn't intervened. So the Lord intervened at that point in time. So he reached out to the fugitive slave, Hagar, as she rested by the fountain in the wilderness that led down to her native land of Egypt. So the angel at this point in time commanded her to return to her mistress and also to name her son Ishmael. So the angel also promised Hagar that her son would have liberty, independence of living, which has ever since characterized the descendants of Ishmael. So we're going to read a little bit about that. But also at this point in time, Hagar learned there for the first time that she learned basically God to be who he was and see him as a living God. So on verse 12 of Genesis chapter 16, the Ishmaelites were roaming freely across the desert, often in conflict with others modern-day Arabs. So the modern-day Arabs consider themselves the descent from Ishmael, and so their brethren, as we know, are the Israelites. So there's an explorer named William Thesiger. You've heard me talk about him before. The last time I talked about his journey and his discoveries through the Middle East. So he, again, I don't know if you remember, I talked about the book called The Arab Sands, and he also wrote a book called The Marsh Arabs. And so the Marsh Arabs, we kind of gave reference to them when I talked about them as far as where the river Euphrates and the Tigris, and they're down south in Iraq. Sodom destroyed that whole area. He flooded. He basically, there was a whole community of people that lived and everything in that area. But so those people and all throughout the Middle East historically have talked about their lineage to Ishmael. And what I thought, even when I was there, and all the years from the 1990s to 2000s, during my times deployed in the Middle East, the constant discussions and conversations, they're always trying to recruit you to become a Muslim. But in patrol bases and wherever we were out in the middle of the desert, these people would talk about their lineage all the way back to Ishmael. So that is kind of significant, because we're going to talk about circumcision here in a little bit, and traditionally, what is some of the things that have changed over time. But one of the things that I found, and if you look back into some of the writings of the 19th century, for example, you hear me, like I said, at Thesiger, he has talked about his discoveries as far as how Arabs rule, how they maintain power, and how they maintain control. And one of the things that he wrote about, he said their government is intentionally individualistic and is successful or unsuccessful according to the degree of fear and respect that whoever's in charge actually commands at that point in time. And so a lot of times when you look at the history of the rulers or the individuals who are in power before they actually drew the lines of countries, before Saudi became Saudi and everything else, it's always been that way. It's always been Saudi, it's always been Iraq, but the Bedouins would move across these border areas before they actually had fences and actual designated hardcore borders. But from that time, and I believe like today, the governments in Arab lands many times are impermanent, and they're liable to end in chaos at any moment in time. And so that was some of the discoveries during that time. It's a little different now, but as you see in the Middle East, there's a lot of warfare and constant conflict. And so, and that's what we're kind of leading up to here, in my opinion. And so that's kind of just a generalized summary of chapter 16. We go to chapter 17. I'm going to start off. I'm going to read the first couple of verses of Genesis chapter 17, and then I'm going to summarize and hit up some of the highlights. So when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you and will multiply you exceedingly. So by this time, Hagar's returned. So the angel, when he actually instructs Hagar to return to her mistress, like we talked about, he also told her what the name of her baby would be. So he told her that you will name your son Ishmael, and then also makes a guarantee about his success and future. And so we see that Abram honored Hagar at this point in time by giving him the name that the maid claimed the angel had chosen. So chapter 17 also shows us a period in Abram's life that challenges his faith. So again, it's been a full 13 years have passed without, I guess, apparently any revelation from God at this point in time. But during that time, Ishmael had grown up. So we're thinking about Ishmael about 13 years old. Abram may have almost insensibly have accustomed himself to look upon Ishmael as his future heir. So 17 kind of lays that out for us. All right, again, I'm summarizing it. But even though he may have assumed that, I think inside, deep down, he knew that Ishmael had not truly been destined to be his heir. And at this time, Abraham is now 99 years old. I say Abraham. He's not Abraham yet, but he's Abram. So forgive me here. And Sarai has also been struck in years. So in these circumstances, a God appeared to Abram again in visible form to establish the fulfillment of the covenant which he had promised to Abram. So in token of the established covenant, God instructed Abram and his descendants the rite of circumcision as a sign and a seal, at the same time changing the name of Abram, which meant father of elevation or high father, into Abraham, which means the father of a multitude, and that of Sarai, the princely, which her name means, into Sarah, the princess. So God did this to convey the promise that will be filled by these two individuals, by Sarah and Abraham. And the chosen race, as we know, the Bible tells us that the chosen race would be spring forth from them, from those two. So these tidings came upon Abraham with joy and surprise, that in his humble worship he fell on his face, he laughed, as he considered within himself the circumstances of the case. And then, have you guys familiar with John Calvin? Yeah, they call him Calvinist and all that. It's the Protestant Reformation and all that stuff. So the book I'm reading right now, I'm reading about the history of Christianity. And so John Calvin is, of course, mentioned in that. There's a book that goes all the way back to, way back to the apostles, actually. And there's two series in the book. So that book goes from the biblical times when after Jesus died to and the second book goes into the Reformation and up until recently and everything else. Anyway, so one of the things I found interesting is that John Calvin remarked, 16th century guy, about Abraham laughing and about his falling down on his face, and he did this not from doubt or disbelief, but also from gladness. So he was gladness and wonder, so to perpetuate the wrongs of the wonder, he promised the seed was to bear the name Isaac. So here, at the outset of Israel's calling, we have three new names. Right? So we have Abraham, we have Sarah, and then, of course, we have Isaac, which are indicative of the power of God that lays at the root of all things, and of the simple faith which received the promise. The heir of the promise was indeed to be the child of Sarah, and that child would be over Ishmael. The Lord would also watch and multiply him exceedingly and make him a great nation. And so that's according to Ishmael. So Ishmael wasn't going to be left out. He's going to have a great nation. He will multiply him exceedingly, a great nation. And but since those days, the sign of circumcision has bore the testimony of the covenant between Abraham and God. So traditionally, on the 8th day after birth, a new period begins. Each circumcised child each kid would be circumcised. Each Jewish child, for the Jews, it was circumcised. The living witness to the transaction, which was a living witness between the transaction between God and Abraham. So this occurred more than 3,000 years ago, and at this point in time, it pointed forward to the fulfillment of the covenant promise between Jesus. And Jesus Christ, whom now there's no other circumcision needed than that of the heart, right? So Jesus fulfilled the old covenant. His death and resurrection fulfilled the requirements of the old covenant, and everything was satisfied through Jesus Christ. On a side note, so we know that this was a covenant that was mandated. So Abraham himself got circumcised. His son Isaac would get circumcised at 8 days old. Circumcision from the time of way back when I talked about Theisiger and some of the other early writings and everything else, that it was traditionally for Arab boys, Muslim boys, for them to get circumcised at 13 years old, because that was the age that Ishmael was circumcised. Now that was talked about and discussed. There's been many writings about the celebrations and that occur within different communities in the desert. When boys reached the age of 13, they became circumcised. Now that was the norm up until recently. So if you were to do your own research, which I suggest, I mean, you can check up on everything I'm saying, there will be plenty of AI inputs and other writings that will say, well, it's never been the case and everything else. But I can tell you from my own personal experience over in the Middle East, that's not the case. And there's been plenty of writings by both Muslims, non-Muslims, and people who've explored and been around in those areas about circumcision. So the boys, as far as the boys getting circumcised at 13. But at this point in time, in Genesis chapter 18, so while Abraham's faith was exercised and blessed, now we're going to get to Lot. The evil men and seducers among Lot, in the area that he had chosen to dwell, have been waxing worse and worse. And so to the point that the sins that they committed and the things they were doing are rapidly filling up the measure of their iniquity. And so the judgment, which had long been stalled, now hung over them like a dark cloud. And it was going to burst at some point into a terrible, terrible upheaval of death and a whirlwind of destruction. And so Abraham is sitting at his tent door in the heat of the day when there's three wayfarers. So I was supposed to actually go to this slide when I was talking about circumcision, I promise. But anyway, so these are three wayfarers right here. So do we know who the three wayfarers are? Well, they're God and two angels, right? So the Bible identifies that, but then the two of those people, right, are going to be identified as men, but they're really angels. And at the point in time on chapter 18, Abraham is sitting at the tent door of the heat of the day, and these three wayfarers, who are God and two angels, which the two angels would be the ministers of God's coming justice, right? So, think about avenging justice. So when they show up, as is the custom of the Bedouin area, the Bedouin community, Abraham did a lot of stuff. So first of all, he noticed that they were there. They came to him. He would not let them leave, right? So he pleaded for them to stay. He asked for them to stay. And as is the custom of that time, and now even in certain areas, he made ready food. And so he went into his wife, tells his wife to fix some meal, make some bread, put it all together. And then he also goes, gets a fattened cow. He prepares milk and a whole spread for them. And so they eat, and while they're eating, he's waiting for them, hand and foot. And so that is still the custom of even in this time, where Abraham, as important as he was, he waited on them, and he stood and waited for them while they ate. So that said, the object of their visit was twofold. The first was a message to Sarah, and the other was to Abraham. And the message to Sarah was that if she was to become the mother of the promised seed, she would have to learn to believe. And so at this point in time, in the chapter 18, if you read through it, you can see that she did not have the faith, 100% belief that she was actually going to give birth or have a son. But again, in our time, when you look at 90s and 100s, we see that as being an old age. And I'm not saying it wasn't old for them as well, but remember, we talked about, Sarah being the age that she was, and she was still considered beautiful. And so age, again, was different. We also talked about the time past, how the environment during the flood or prior to the flood was different than the environment after the flood. So things changed. So when we talk about age, was a lot different. But again, they were still a pretty good age, as the Bible tells us. At any rate, the first inquiry of the three was after Sarah, and which was the message of birth of a son, which they now directly addressed to her, and her non-belief appeared in laughter. So I could imagine, once you realize who you're talking to, and that God addresses you face to face. But he did. All right. So now the Lord himself tells Abraham, right, of the other purpose and the reason that the three of them came. So it was to tell him of the impending doom of the cities on the plain, and that for other reasons. Okay, so the other reasons were because Abraham was to be the heir to the promise that God made him, and because he would, as verse 19 tells us of chapter 18, that he would command his children and his household after him, and that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, and the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. So in Genesis chapter 18, verse 20, from these words we know that God told Abraham about Sodom's pending doom, which will later actually serve forever as a warning to Israel. So now going to Genesis chapter 19. Do you have any questions so far? I'm just doing all the talking, so all right. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. 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 Thank you. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. So Genesis chapter 19, Sodom was not regarded as an isolated judgment, but a scene of desolation, which would forever occupy the cities of the plain and showcase the consequences of sin. So it is in this light that the Old Testament, actually the Old and the New Testament, present to us the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So on the other hand, God's covenant made a gift of all the land to Abraham as his seed. As a result, it seemed reasonable that Abraham should know of the terrible desolation that would soon spread over it. So this is why, by that point, I think that God actually told Abraham. So he sends off his two angels, then he sits with Abraham. And it's kind of interesting what happens here. And so we see here Abraham's character, that he acts at this point in time as a medium trying to intercede for Sodom and Gomorrah. And we get also a glimpse of God. So God is great. God is wonderful, and he's fantastic. And he is a jealous God. The Bible tells us that. But we see through God, through Jesus, the grace of God as well, because in the future, he He's always thinking of us. All right, he always has us in mind. So, as powerful as he is, he actually listens to Abraham. So when Abraham intercedes, he does so first with 50, then 40, then down to 10. He's talking about righteous people. And so I'm going to talk about the word righteousness. I'm going to speed up a little bit here because I really like to get to the point where to describe to you some of the things I've written down through my research about Lot. But anyway, at this point in time in Genesis chapter 19, Abraham is trying to intercede for Sodom and Gomorrah and pleads the case for their preservation, and God listened. In this light, Abraham's urgency reminds us of the true characteristic of holy importunity over boldness, and that God's forgiveness is to be crested in specifics, not generalities concerning earthborn situations. And so that's what Abraham does at this point in time. And so God promised to spare Sodom and Gomorrah even if, right? So we talked about 50, 40, and down to 10. 10 righteous men were found in them. But the results of the trial by the two angels who went to Sodom were even more terrible than any human could ever anticipated. So I imagine that the last brief night of horror in Sodom soon passed, and as the morning glow, which the Bible does say that, it says that as the morning glow came, as the morning glow lay on the hills of Moab, the angels also constrained Lot and his family to leave the doomed city. All right. At this point, we see that God extended mercy to Lot, but he did not escape consequences of his choice to live in this area. So on that note, I would like to take this time to discuss a few things that we talked about as far as my observations about Lot and his family. So first of all, we know very little, in my opinion, based on all the research. I found very little on Lot's early life. But Joshua chapter 24, verse 2 tells us that his family was involved in idolatry when God called Abraham. Genesis chapter 11, verses 28 and 31 tells us that Lot's father, Haran, died before they left Ur to go to Canaan. However, there is no passage that states that his grandfather, Terah, or his uncle, Nahor, ever came to believe in the one true God. All right? And for that matter, no text says that Lot was a God-fearing man or a believer. Although it is implied that he had some faith, evidently derived from Abraham, his uncle, we never read of his building an altar like Abraham did. We never read of him praying like Abraham did. We never read about him worshiping God like Abraham did. He's only described as righteous in contrast to the wicked lifestyles of the Sodomites, which the Bible tells us tormented his soul, as told to us in Peter chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. So I looked up the word righteousness. Now again, we're not talking about what they consider righteousness in the Bible. I'm talking about righteousness according to the Oxford Human Dictionary. The word righteousness means morally right, virtuous, law-abiding, etc. So the question of whether or not Lot was a believer still remains in question for some. And again, I'm not saying I'm right. These are just some of the things that I researched and read about. So the Bible doesn't tell us that Lot thanked God for his abundant blessings, nor was he grateful when the angels warned him of the impending doom or destruction. In fact, Genesis chapter 19, verses 15 to 19 tells us that Lot resisted the attempts of the angels to save him and his family. So this is something you can read, and if you get back to me and let me know what you think. But instead of fleeing to the mountains like the angels had instructed, he urged them, pleaded with them to go to the town of Zoar. Now, he just came from a city, right? And cities are bad. And you can read about the thing that the Romans and the Greeks called cityfication and what happens in those places, right? And there's a lot of bad things. And historically, cities have not been the greatest places. You heard me talk about Wilfred Thesiger, talks about how the mannerisms and behaviors in the city was greatly different than what he saw in the Bedouin community. He talked about prostitutes and homosexuals and everything else that happened in the cities. And I'm not saying because we live here in the city that that's the case. What I'm saying is that what he saw in the cities, he expected to see in the Bedouin community, because a lot of these people, these men, would travel long distances and be away from their families for months at a time. And again, if you remember, I talked about these people doing raids and fighting and everything else when they weren't farming. And when they were farming, when they weren't farming, they were raiding. And when they weren't raiding, they were farming. But he never saw any, these men would sleep together and everything else. What I mean by sleep together, they sleep like in a patrol base or on encampments and whatnot. But they never engaged in any form of homosexuality or anything like that. And he said he was surprised at that, because he expected to see anything. He would expect this, if he expected to see anything like that, he would expect to see it with the Bedouin community, which he never did. But he saw it in the cities. Matthew chapter 24, verse 2, and verses 16 to 21 also tells us that when Jesus saw the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple on the horizon, he warned the people about being tied to their possessions, and turning back to look at houses and possessions when he said, remember Lot's wife. Yes, sweetie. Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I'm giving you all these different things, you know, to think about. But like, for example, he, in Genesis chapter 19, he warns his son-in-laws, right? He tells them that, you know, you need to leave. The angels go and say, look, if you have anybody in your house, if you have a son-in-laws, you have daughters and everything else, get out, leave now. But Lot, as the head of his family, even when he talked to his son-in-laws, they all thought he was joking. They didn't take him seriously. And so, you know, his priorities seemed somewhat skewed, in my opinion, and he just couldn't think of a life apart from Sodom. I mean, the point, he wanted to go back to another city. But Lot lived in this evil environment for some time, and of course, evidently without speaking out against the vile practices of the Sodomites. And his feeble influence for good was ineffective when he tried to stop the licentious men from raping the angels who had come into his house for shelter. So he made the shocking suggestion that it would be better for them to satisfy their lust with his two daughters. All right, and the Bible says there's two virgin daughters. So I just, when reading this and doing a deep dive and reading about it and everything else, these are things that I discovered. And so rather than stand up for what was good and wholesome, Lot proposed what he evidently thought was the lesser of two evils, delivering his two helpless daughters into the hand of depraved men. In my opinion, this illustrates the extent to which his righteousness had been compromised by living too close to this environment. All right, that's just that. And again, I'm giving you my opinion. And so he seemed to have lost, albeit temporarily, his moral compass. And so, because he feared the Sodomites. On the other hand, maybe Lot was a secret disciple for fear of the Sodomites. And so I used that in thinking about, one of the books I'm reading compares Lot's lack of fortitude and righteousness to that of Joseph of Arimathea in the New Testament, as described in John chapter 19, verse 38, which tells us that Joseph was a secret disciple of Jesus because he feared the Jews. So, still in Genesis chapter 19, let me know if the bell rings or whatever. I didn't hear it. Genesis chapter 19 tells us that the angels told Lot and his family, do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. But verse 26 shows the lingering regret for the city that led to Lot's wife turning back behind her when God's judgment overtook her and turned her into a pillar of salt. Go right here. It did? Okay. All right. Well, that's it. So I hope I didn't bother anybody. And again, just to let you know, how I ended on my thoughts about Lot was that he was a righteous man, right? And I was going to give you and tell you about how blessed we are. This whole narrative of Lot and his family tells us how fortunate and blessed we are, because despite the mistakes, the horrible things that he did, in my opinion, he still was saved. And just like all of us, none of us, we're consistently sinners in the whole 9 yards. And even though he was considered biblically righteous, the righteousness in Bible is much more than what the Oxford Dictionary says. And so because of that, he was deemed righteous, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, and he was saved. And so that gives me great hope and comfort, knowing that as imperfect as I am, and undeserving as I am, that I can be saved. So that's it. Thank you.